We want to thank everybody who is here on this evening. If you have your phones, we want to make sure that you share the streams, send it to all of your platforms, everything that you have. If you are a guest, a visitor, welcome to the community of faith. We will be beginning momentarily. Once the countdown finishes, the guests will be here, the panel will be here, and we will get started. Again, thank you for your presence on this evening.
Good evening, good evening. Welcome to this Empower Talk conversation discussing the genius, the wisdom, brilliance, the rare brilliance and the rare genius of the iconic, legendary, never to be forgotten, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. We're so excited to have this conversation. Hybrid, of course, people are still deciding whether they go to church on a Monday or a Sunday or not, but we're here tonight with a hybrid audience. Most of our viewers, of course, will be streaming live from around the nation and around the world. We're honored to have guests with us here who are a part of this panel discussion, but all of you who are here, would you do me a favor and give each other a hand for being here tonight, because you made a smart decision. I love to celebrate smart people making smart decisions, and you made a smart decision to be here, because we're going to have an opportunity in just a little bit for you to ask questions as well, to be a part of this conversation. My name is Dr. James Dixon. I am the host of Empower Talk, president of the Houston branch of the NAACP, and about 50 other things as well. And most excited to be the father of Mariah Nicole, who's 25, a TSU graduate as well, and in business, and Victoria Elise, who's now 18 years old, on her way to Xavier University this coming August to study business and entrepreneurship, and James Wallace Edwin Dixon III, who is a ninth grade student and who is also a part of his black student movement at his school and the president of Good Gang USA. So I'm really excited about posterity and generational impact. And I'm saying that to set up the fact that that's what really excites me about tonight's conversation, is that we've got our special guest here, and I'll introduce our panelists in just a moment, but I'm really particularly concerned and excited to have with us tonight the great-grandson of W.E.B. Du Bois, in the person of Mr. Jeffrey Peck, who's sitting to my right. Would you just, okay, yes, that's how you do that, because we never treat the uncommon like it's common. So excited to have Jeff here with us on tonight. He is underspoken, understated, one of the humblest persons you will ever meet in your entire life. I mean, if somebody else you knew was the great-grandson or great-granddaughter of W.E.B. Du Bois, you would know it. I mean, he'd probably have a sign in the window in that car, a bumper sticker or something, you know what I mean? Something to let you know, hey, by the way I am, that. But you could be around Jeffrey Peck for days, months, and even years and would not have known that at all, because he doesn't wear it as a badge of honor. He accepts it as an assignment of humility. And I think we ought to give him another hand for that because of that. Jeff, we're excited to be here tonight. And why is this exciting for you, by the way?
First of all, thank you for having me, Bishop Dixon. It's exciting for me because I knew what my mother was attempting to do for many years. She wanted to promote her grandfather's legacy. And in many conversations, she told me a lot about her conversations with him. And when we were having these conversations, I didn't see the vision that she had for me. I just thought we were talking about family. We were just talking about things that were personal between her and her grandfather. And little did I know, when she passed, she was passing a baton for me to do many things going forward. And then the way the Lord had it, me and Bishop Dixon came together. He accepted the honor of doing my mother's funeral, and as we spoke, we realized God put us together for a reason. And so that's why we're here tonight. It's legacy. It's what God would have us do, and it's what my mother wanted me to do. So I never professed to be a historian. I never professed to be someone that, was a public speaker, but my father made me stand up in church for many years, I guess, preparing me
I know about
for
that.
this, and teaching Sunday school, and my sister's in the audience. She knows the feeling. And so I guess I'm not too shy about speaking about my family, but for the most part, it wasn't something that I foresaw myself doing. It's just something that I feel I must do.
Well, we're excited to have you tonight, and it was just really surprising to learn that the posterity of W.E. Du Bois lived here in the Houston area, and have been there all those years. Right now, I thought we knew everything about us in Houston. I mean, we know who lives in Houston, and but the fact that you and your family are here is very, very special. So let me just pause to introduce these individuals who are with us tonight to have this conversation. Of course, to my left is a Du Bois scholar. I mean, a real, some people call themselves scholars. You know, in our community, how I say, hey, Doc. You know, that might not mean, you know. But this is a real doctor. I mean, a real Du Bois scholar, Dr. Phil Senatier, who is a professor at the College of Biblical Studies, and we're honored to have you here tonight, Dr. Phil. You can say, Dr. Come on, so y'all met Dr. Phil tonight. Yeah, you're in the house with Dr. Phil. This is really Dr. Phil, and we're honored to have you here tonight. And I know you're going to give us some information that's very vital in just a moment. But thank you for coming. And then Dr. Carla Braley, who is also a professor at Texas Southern University. She teaches the master's level courses there at TSU. And I've had the privilege of visiting her class. Actually speaking, well, I don't know what I was talking about, whatever it was. It was in religion, something that made sense, right? Okay, good. I want to make sure I did well. You know, you don't ever want the doctor to fire you. But honored to have her here tonight. She's also a state elected official as relates to Harris County Democrats, Texas Democrats rather. And we're honored to have you with us tonight. So I want to start, Dr. Phil, if you can just give us, you know, when I heard that Dr. Phil, the Du Bois scholar, we want to meet at Jeff's house. I was excited about that. He was excited about your in-depth study and intrigue into the Du Bois legacy and content. How did you get stirred up about W.E.B. Du Bois, and where has it led you? How did it lead you to this moment tonight?
Well, thanks for the invitation to be here tonight, Dr. Bishop Dixon. It's a real honor. I appreciate it. I first encountered Du Bois in Houston as a student at the University of Houston. Had a wonderful professor in graduate school who introduced me to the doctor's writings and his work. And I first began to study Du Bois in about 2007 or 2008. And as the scholars do, we eventually find our way up to Massachusetts, where his papers are, and we begin to read his papers and learn about his work. And thankfully, that work is now largely digitized, so anybody with an internet connection can read the work of Du Bois. As I delved into the doctor's writings and his life, I began to think about why it's important to study Du Bois. And it would take 5 or 6 hours to just scratch the surface, but I know we don't have that kind of time. But I want to talk a little bit about why it's important in this moment today to think about Du Bois, to think with Du Bois, to read his work, to think about his legacy, not just in Houston, but across the world. So why study Du Bois? The first answer to that question is that he has a capacious intellect. He has a capacious intellect, and what I mean by that is his training in college was that in the liberal arts. He studied history and literature and philosophy and sociology, and he brought all those disciplines, all those perspectives to bear on the color line, the problem of segregation, the problem of racism, and he took those perspectives and tried to find a solution for 80 years. He was born in 1868, 3 years after the Civil War ended, and he died in 1963, literally the day before Dr. King gave his famous speech in Washington, D.C. And so Du Bois started writing as a teenager, And so for 80 of his 95 years, he wrote, he published, he thought, he traveled in search of a solution to what he called the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So he took this capacious intellect and he stayed curious throughout his entire life. He was unafraid to ask big questions, hard questions. He was fearless in his critique of the United States because he believed that democracy was possible, and he spent his life struggling for that. And he spent his life preoccupied with a central question of human existence. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to live free? And he traveled the world in search of trying to answer this question. But for Du Bois, the question of freedom wasn't just about individual liberty. It wasn't just about personal emancipation. There was always a social dimension. There was always a communal dimension. And he saw this, the connection that he saw had to do with both economic equality and political equality. He saw those two quests for freedom working together.
Not Phil. You just hit on two very salient points. And I hate to break this in because I know you're supposed to give your opening, but I couldn't miss the moment. You just said for Du Bois, he struggled with this prevalent question, what it means to be human, right? And of course, for him, to be human had to be equated to being freedom, being free. That if you're not free, you don't live the human experience. And you mentioned two areas that quantifies that, economics and politics. Why is that relevant for us today?
Well, it's relevant for us today because the United States still struggles to realize its full democratic promise. And Du Bois had this phrase that he used in his writing, and he talked about looking forward into the past.
Yes.
And as a historian and a scholar, Du Bois was always concerned with the future. He was always concerned with solutions. After all, as a sociologist who is concerned with human behavior and human society, he wants people to live more freely. And so the point of looking forward into the past is to think about what's on the horizon, but it's always grounded in historical precedent, historical study, and deep historical study.
Okay, I want to take a point of privilege here, Dr. Brady. You, as a professor, would get this. Class, you should write that statement down. Looking forward by looking into the past. Let me just tell you, I have thought about that as a preacher, right? As a theologian, because when you talk about looking forward by looking into the past, there's nothing new under the sun. And so if you don't understand the past reflectively, you might not get a clear vision of the future. Could that be then why so many people, Commissioner Ellis, who are prognosticators about the future keep getting it wrong? Because they've never taken an honest look at the past. Does that make sense? I mean, and which is why some people might argue with us, Ron Reynolds, about what we're trying to do in the future, because they've never taken the time, like Dr. Field has, studying Du Bois in the past, which is what Du Bois did quite intricately. Is that making sense?
That's right, and you made an important observation. You said, take the time to study. Take the time to study. And Du Bois, as I said earlier, was fearlessly asked hard questions. Questions that could not be answered in a tweet or a Facebook post, but questions that needed time and deliberation and study and comparison and discussion. And so Du Bois, as it turned out, had a lot of time, 80 years of writing and thinking. But because he returned to this central question, this fundamental question of freedom, that he pursued an answer through academic books, through poetry, through prayers, through plays, and he expressed his thoughts in all these different genres, which, again, speaks to this question of taking the time to think and construct paragraphs and sentences and ideas to answer this question of what it meant what it means to live free.
Free. All right. So let me come to you, Jeff, and then we're going to pivot to our two join us here today. As you listen to this scholar talk about your great-grandfather, first of all, how does it make you feel? Personally, not professionally, just as a dude, as a brother.
Well, I've traveled to Great Barrington about 5 or 6 years straight to hear scholars from all over the world, from the Bahamas, from Europe, and the United States talk about Dr. Du Bois and all the things that he was involved in his life, from human rights to, fighting for people abroad as well as people here, is involvement in the NAACP, just all that he got into. And first thing I think of is, how did he have time to do all the things that he did? And my mother said, well, he would have a strict schedule, and if anybody tried to break that schedule, he would refuse to allow them to do that. He even had a time frame set up to sleep, and he knew when he was going to eat. Everything was planned.
Everything was planned.
And so that's how he achieved so much, because he was an incredible planner. His work in human rights is what really touches me the most, to care about people the way that he did. And from a young man all the way up to when he left here, he just was just overwhelmingly into seeing that people had the basic things, the food, medication, and education, all the basic things he felt everyone should have, he was fighting for. And, in name of the NAACP, he used the word colored because he wasn't just aiming at black people in general, he was aiming at anyone of color. So he cared about everyone.
Yeah.
And he wanted all of us to work together, and he didn't exclude white people because he cared about them too. He wanted us to be unified as a nation and come together, and he stood for all the things that Dr. King spoke about just 100 years before Dr. King.
Wow. So, Commissioner Ellis, as you sit here today, and you've traveled, you've studied, both here in the U.S. and abroad, when did you first become acquainted with the substance of Du Bois, and how significant was his impact in your estimation? Why is it relevant now?
Bishop, thank you for being the consummate Renaissance bishop, for having us here tonight to have this discussion. It is important. So give my bishop, my pastor, another warm round of applause. Jeff, I'm glad to meet you and your sister. Where your sister? Wave so I can see your hand back there. I want to encourage you both to not just speak, but also be visible. Yeah. It's your duty. History pretty much belongs, unfortunately, in this country in particular, to those who write it. And oftentimes it's not accurate, but they write it. I'm going to answer your question, Bishop, but that's why, and thank you, Dr. Phil, for the work that you're doing. This dialogue is important. I want you to do more. I want you to go to my high school, to Worthing High School, and give this discussion. And even if your sister's the bashful one, you got to figure out how you perpetuate our legacy. It's not just your great-great-grandfather. He's our great leader. And that is important. Bishop, I first heard of W.E.B. Du Bois when I was at Woodson Junior. It was called Junior High School. Junior high, yeah. So if I might date myself, been born in 1954. And back then we had Negro History Week. It's a month now. But, and they would assign students to have to do a little paper and talk about people. I was not the one who was assigned W.E.B. Du Bois. I think I had Harriet Tubman. I can't really remember now. But somebody had to present in class. And then obviously would come up every year in high school. Other than the one semester, I went to a integrated school. It didn't come up when I went to San Jacinto High School because we didn't celebrate National Negro History Week at San Jacinto High School in 1969, my freshman year, 10th grade. And then at Xavier, I started off at Xavier, my freshman year in college in 1972. I don't know if your mother was teaching there then or not. She went to that 88, because I do know I did call when the bishop was going to Great Barrington to speak at the funeral. I called up Tim Francis, whose father was the first lay president of Xavier, and I said, hey, did you know she taught at Xavier? I said, I guess I must have flunked that class. So I'm glad to know that she was not there. But that was my first introduction, and I've had the privilege of going to W.E.B. Du Bois's home, to his burial site. First time a more memorable occasion I went there was with Reverend Jesse Jackson. They were celebrating, I think, the 50th anniversary of Ghana's independence. And I think I was trying to remember earlier, it seems like when W.E.B. Du Bois died, and then I think either the day before or day after, they got word that Whitney Young drowned in Nigeria. And I've heard Reverend Jackson tell that story each time I've been to Ghana with him. But just what a rich history. And I tell you the impact it had on me. When I heard whoever presented that paper talk about that talented 10th, I didn't know where I'd end up in life, but I knew where I was.
Wow.
And I knew I wanted to be part of that 10th.
Yeah.
And for maybe the impact of W.E.B. Du Bois, all of us, why do we focus on the top 10%? I was the last one in high school, hanging on. I think somebody might have changed the grade so I wouldn't lose my scholarship. I'm not sure. They might have taken that one class, that French class, I think, to help me. But so much is focused on the 10th.
Yes.
Top 10th.
The top 10th.
10% graduating class for whatever reason. But I knew growing up out there as a full-headed little boy in Sunnyside, because of W.E.B. Du Bois, I wanted to be in that
talented 10th.
in that talented 10%.
Yeah, awesome. I tell you, Dr. Braley, as I listen to Commissioner Ellis, and you're still working with students, of course, at TSU. When I mentioned this opportunity to you, you said, Bishop, I'm not coming because you asked me. I'm coming because you asked me to come talk about Du Bois. She was very clear that she's a Du Bois fanatic. Why so?
So let me just say thank you for the invitation. This is probably one of the most honorable days I've had. This will go down on my list, because just being in your presence means I'm actually in the presence of Du Bois.
Yes.
And that's an honor. I mean, so I told Bishop that I would be there even if I had to carry your bag, because that meant I was carrying Du Bois' bag. And so I'm good with that. So for me, I would say, unfortunately, when I was first introduced to W.E. Du Bois, probably was maybe middle school, but I was introduced to Du Bois as a writer, really as someone who did literature. And I did not come to really understand the life, the legacy of Du Bois until graduate school. And not just graduate school, probably doctoral studies. And for me, Du Bois, right now to this day, anything that I do intellectually, I, for the most part, will start from Du Bois. I mean, he was the first intellectual to really understand and dive into what we now call intersectionality.
Yes.
Because you talk about the political and the economic, but Du Bois also had a real clear understanding about the the essence of gender and black women in labor. And so for me, when I began to really understand Du Bois and what it meant in terms of him being able to identify the problem of the 20th century, which he alluded to at the time, the colored line, but it was always my understanding is that when we understood the brutalization of slavery in America and the impact, continued impact that that had on Black America, from Du Bois' perspective, if we could solve the problem, as he called it, the Negro problem, then that would mean that we can solve the problems of America because it was that bad in terms of the treatment and services, the lack of services, some of which we're still going to the day. And one of them was voting rights. That was something that he clearly named. And so for me, it was always very important because Du Bois said we can study science all day long, but we had to make sure that we did two things, that we study for truth, to discover truth, but when we discovered truth, it couldn't just stop there. It had to bring about reform. Because it was a mission, and science was not just this typical science. And so even when we say sociology, we take that for granted because at that time, sociology did not exist. And so now he's getting the accolades of being one of the founders or the founder of sociology. Because it was then that science was just stopping at the mere fact of just studying people. But we could not merely study humanity if we were not going to solve the problems of humanity. So I can go on, but for me, Du Bois is still very relevant today. When we look at his work today, one would say, unfortunately, we're still going through some of those same issues that we're facing, and that goes back because we did not solve the Negro problem.
Did not solve the problem. So Dr. Phil, jump in here with your scholarly perspective because I love to pick the brains of people like you and Carla. Carla is a sister, but she's a scholar, right? And so I love to pick the brains of people who have studied academically. From your perspective, as we're talking about the relevance of Du Bois, we do know that there was such a gap, a period in U.S. history where Du Bois was completely unpopular, right? And even when we watched the play in Great Barrington, we had to deal with the fact that Du Bois was not a celebrity here as most people would think. You know, in a certain circle for some time, but then the nation rejected the mind of Du Bois, and I think, Commissioner, perhaps it has something to do with that talented tent that he was elevating. But I wanted to get your scholarly perspective on that. What makes it difficult for the United States of America to embrace a son like W.E.B. Du Bois?
Part of what we're talking about with this period of Du Bois's life when the United States sought to erase his existence is the 1950s, the era of the Cold War, the era of McCarthyism, the era of anti-communism. Starting in the 1930s, Du Bois began to read a lot of Karl Marx, who took an economic analysis of world history. And Du Bois began to think about the category of economic analysis of Black history and global Black history at that. And so he began to write a book, for example, titled Black Reconstruction, where he reinterpreted the Civil War era, the Reconstruction era, with Black people at the center as historical actors who were architects of their own liberation. They forged freedom themselves. And so this perspective led him to think in larger terms about global Black history, which he continued to do through his work with the UN in the mid to late 1940s and his anti-nuclear activism with an organization called the Peace Information Center. And things got so hot during the Cold War that in February of 1951, Du Bois was arrested by the US government on suspicion that he was working on behalf of the Russians. And he was booked in jail. He made bail, but a trial date was set. And it was in November of 1951 that Du Bois finally went to trial. But he and his second wife, Shirley Graham, and many advocates spent the better part of 1951 fundraising for his legal fees. And he was acquitted miraculously in November of 1951. And while this persecution, this anti-communist persecution, deeply hurt Du Bois, the flip side of that is that it steeled his resolve to black liberation. It steeled his resolve to pursue economic equality. And even though he was acquitted, he was still ignored. He was criticized in newspapers. His friends didn't support him for a good while. And in fact, the United States government confiscated his passport and the passport of Shirley Du Bois from 1951 until 1958. He was not allowed to travel outside of the United States. And so he wrote in his final autobiography, he was worried at that point. And he said that the children may forget my name. He talked about Negro History Week and those early presentations. That was a concern of his, not in a sense of vanity, yeah. Right? But because he knew that his work was not just for his liberation alone; it was for the greater community, and that was his overriding concern. And it really wasn't until the 1980s that scholars began to revisit some of this late career work. However, I will say that Du Bois's legacy, that economic legacy, the Black Panther Party drew from that. The Black Studies movement drew from that as well.
Yeah.
So.
And of course, the Civil Rights Movement, of course, Dr. King embraced Du Bois. It's interesting, the last major sermon of Dr. King's speech in New York was at a celebration honoring the legacy of Du Bois. And I thought that was quite interesting because Dr. King, we do know in his latter years, was also being rejected by the United States of America with some of the same accusations that had been levied against Du Bois. And so it intrigues me, Commissioner, that there is something about the American psyche that tends to respond that way to Du Boisian thinking. If it is truly cutting-edge liberation understanding, and I love intersectionality too. I think he intersected sociology with science as well as with theology because as we study Du Bois, by the way, I was fascinated to learn, Jeff, that your great-grandfather wrote church hymns, Christian hymns. Did y'all know he was a hymn writer? Did anybody here ever heard that Du Bois wrote music? I mean, isn't it fascinating that we're sitting here talking about W.E.B. Du Bois, and he wrote many songs. In fact, how much did he published something every 6 or 8 days? I mean, literally, he was publishing, Jeff, all the time producing content. So I'm just intrigued by that, Dr. Braley. I know you're itching to jump in here on that, and I know Commissioner as well. Go ahead. I'm going to go.
Well, I know Dr. Phil and Dr. Braley, being much more scholarly than I am, have researched it, but W.E.B. Du Bois was not a big fan of organized religion. And part of the criticism of him was, to be honest with you, in the jargon of that era, he would have been a Talkback Negro. I fall in that category too.
Better define that.
So in other words, somebody born a few days after the Civil War ended, did you say 3? He had to get 2 bachelor's degrees. Went to Fisk, but Harvard didn't accept a bachelor's degree from Fisk. So we got another one. First black person, was it to get a PhD or get one from Harvard?
Get one from Harvard.
First black person in the country to get a PhD or from Harvard?
From Harvard.
From Harvard.
PhD from Harvard.
PhD from Harvard. But, he was an independent thinker. Look, it's common if people don't agree with us or you all today, if they can't win on the merits of their argument, Representative Reynolds, then they find something else they don't like. They don't like the way you dress. They don't like the party you're in. They don't like the fact you didn't go to church every day. But the real issue is they disagree with you. Now, in a country where we say we have respect for the First Amendment, that's what it was.
Yeah.
I mean, here's a guy criticizing Jim Crow, had the unmitigated gall to criticize lynching,
Yes.
to criticize inequality for black folks. And a lot of King's key supporters, some, his best organizers, he had to back away from, put them in the background, because J. Edgar Hoover in that crowd were criticizing them. So for some reason, just go say somebody is communist. And some people don't make a distinction between socialism and communism. You got me? One being a form of government, the other one being an economic system.
Yes.
But so look, who would admit that what we did in the history of this country was put a whole group of people. This country was built on the backs of African labor, and then it became slave labor.
Sure.
You want to talk about that? That could get ugly.
Yeah.
Well, here's a guy who was saying those kinds of things, so it was common to go and do that. But that's why I think it's so important. People disagreed with him, and it was a way to try and stop him. And the momentum that was growing. Marcus Garvey, a big part of his movement was the Back to Africa movement.
Yeah.
Pan-Africanism, since, first black person who would admit they were black in the Brazilian Senate, Albeditas Nascimento was a dear friend of W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah.
Now, they had other, in Brazil, they have the largest black population outside of Nigeria. Second largest black population in the world, not in America, it's in Brazil. Largest is in Nigeria. And they had other blacks in the Senate, but they wouldn't admit they were black. They looked like us and say, either you Afro-Brazil. No. Portuguese. You got me? But so that was the criticism of him. And it was common for King, Constance Baker Motley, and others in that area. It was a way to cut them off. So you go in, as you referred to it, the Cold War mentality.
Yeah. And make it dangerous to support them.
Oh, yeah.
I mean that's still a methodology that we have to kind of talk about sometimes too, because.
And I was going to say that problem with the church was because for most of the early history of this country, people used religion. They didn't take scripture out of the Bible, Cain, and to justify slavery.
Yes.
So that was it. And with the black church.
Yes.
Now, it'd be interesting. You talk about it later, because I'd be interested to know. Of course, King was there for Ghana's independence. One of his speeches, he talks about how Kwame Nkrumah danced with the Queen of England. Yeah. So it talks about how the flag, the British flag went up, came down, and then the Ghanaian independence flag went up. But I'd be interested to learn more about the relationship between King, because the Montgomery bus boycott did come along, and Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, for some of our scholars, Bishop.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dr. Brady, and then we'll come back to.
Well, I mentioned earlier, I think by that time, Du Bois, which we haven't really talked a lot about, was very radical in terms of how, he thought about not only life, but life in the United States. And you mentioned that he was a planner, and he was so disciplined that Commissioner going to Harvard, he had to start completely over from Fisk, right? And he was the first to get his PhD.
From Harvard.
Period,
yeah.
First black.
That's black.
Yeah, yes. And and I tell my students too, that not only was he willing to start completely over, how many of us would start our degrees completely over? But he had to be out of the library before dark.
Yes.
Let's just
Think
about how many times we've had to go to the library. Some of you all been in law school, some of you first degree, midterms, finals. Yeah. Now that wasn't the case for all students, but Du Bois, the black male,
Yes.
had to be off campus by dark.
By dark. Yes.
And what I love about understanding Du Bois's life is that he lived so long that we could see his growth, the evolution of Du Bois, because he really started off thinking that science was the answer. If I just learned the systematic process of understanding humanity, then we can solve this problem.
Yeah.
And then he began to be an organizer because that didn't work.
Yes.
He started organizing. NAACP came. And he realized then that that wasn't, going to be the be-all, end-all in terms of taking us over the top. And Commissioner alluded to the notion of religion. The church for Du Bois, it was important in terms of understanding the life and culture of African American, but he really thought that the pressing matter was that we really had to understand that we had to, I won't say necessarily go against this system, but we definitely had to call out the system. And I brought this up just to say that history, we take for granted that we just study history, but at the time, and even now, positive scientists did not look at history, because if you look at history, then you have to state that it is a problem, and if you honor that it is a problem, then you have to do something about the problem. So he spent his entire life trying to do something about a problem that he later felt that, if we didn't take certain precautions, that it was not going to happen.
Yeah, well, you said he was a radical, and
I didn't go too much in detail,
no, but that's
yeah.
necessary because a radical comes from the word radicai, in the Latin word that means to agitate. And it's, your washing machine won't clean clothes if there's not an agitator in it, right? You do understand that. If you don't put clean clothes in the washing machine, you put dirty, stained clothes in the washing machine, without an agitator, those things are not coming out. And so Du Bois was radical in the sense that he was not simply making noise. The fact that he could intellectualize an argument to the point that you could not deny his scholarship. He was not simply emotional, he was intellectual and theological and sociological and scientific, all wrapped up in one personality, which means that you could not write him off as illiterate, insignificant, and emotional. That disturbed the status quo. But I do admire the fact that he had the courage to challenge the system, Jeff, to the point that the system had to respond to it. And of course, Du Bois was a founder of the NAACP. If you want to follow in his footsteps and continue his legacy, make sure you are a member of the local branch of the Houston NAACP. We're glad to have our first vice president here, Carl Cummings, with us tonight, and who's the first vice president. Janice Weaver is here. She is an executive committee member. Janice, wave your hand. You all know Janice works for the mayor, but she's also with the Houston NAACP. We're honored to have her as well. And Representative Ron Reynolds, his name has been called. He's going to greet us before we go tonight. And then Europa is here for Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. But I want to say all of those people are members of the NAACP, and because we're continuing that legacy. Dr. Phil, can you talk to us for just a moment, if we kind of transition a little bit, into the Du Bois, you were talking about slavery and the vestiges that remain. One of his quotes, and by the way, when I got the call, Jeff, honestly, and I want to come to that, I don't want to forget to talk about that, because this is always in my car. I keep this Du Bois, the Reader, by David Levering Lewis, in my car every day. Like, if you get in my car, I have a mobile library, and because I don't like to waste time. My deal is, I am so ignorant, I got to get rid of some of it every day. I think it would be completely blasphemous for me to wake up a day and not learn something, because that's arrogance. If you don't learn something every day, that means you think you're smart. And so I keep smart people with me every day. But one of the famous quotes that I like, I should say famous but powerful, is Du Bois said this, get this, the slave went free, stood for a moment in the sun, and then went back into slavery. The slave went free, stood for a moment in the sun, then went back into slavery. This was a sort of pathology that Du Bois sought to address. It troubled him. Coming back to this whole issue of freedom, I thought, Jeff, and I want your opinion on this, that perhaps Du Bois is pointing out that the slave did not yet see himself as fully human to the point that he would accept not being free. Give me your perspective on that.
Of course, the quote you referenced there, Du Bois is talking about the backlash, or as we say today, the white lash against the political progress of Reconstruction.
Reconstruction, right.
The systematic lynching of black bodies, white supremacist violence against people who had liberated themselves, who had fought for their freedom. And what strikes me about that quote and the context, the historical context that Du Bois is talking about with that quote is the context of Jim Crow, and this is the context in which he is educated, in which he starts to develop a historical consciousness. And this leads to his first book, his Harvard dissertation on the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes.
And so at the precise moment that he's talking about in this quotation, Jim Crow America, he's thinking as a scholar about the foundations of that oppression within the context of the transatlantic slave trade. And so he does the documentation. He talks about the earliest abolitionist movement, and at the end of that book, he talks about he moves into literary mode, and he says he critiques the United States and says that until the United States is willing to face the truth about its history, the country is not going to be free. And so that historical analysis is rooted in his first book, and then his next book, he studies this question of unfreedom in Philadelphia and begins the field of urban sociology with his book, The Philadelphia Negro. And so in the middle of this period of time that your quote references, Du Bois is looking forward into the past. He's going back to the transatlantic slave trade. He's exploring black communities in urban settings in Philadelphia specifically. And so this quote brings to mind and brings to the surface Du Bois's scholarly analysis, historical analysis of the urgency of freedom, because he published his book on the slave trade in 1896, published his book on the Philadelphia Negro in 1899, in the middle of Jim Crow America. So he was a radical even then, because his scholarship he was writing against white supremacist scholarship at the time, and documenting the black experience, and using that as a foundation for freedom.
That was a bold undertaking at a time when lynching was at its height.
Bishop, we're lucky that W.E.B. Du Bois used his gift of writing, his intellectual skill, to make a record of it.
Sure.
And you remember I did my paper on Harriet Tubman. And some historians now, these folks that say they're the ones who write the history, will take this statement from her, but at least I was told she was being congratulated after she'd gotten her freedom for having freed so many slaves, and her response was, I would have freed a lot more if only they had known they were slaves.
Yeah.
So now, what your line reminds me of, now, if you Google it, they will say she didn't say that. Well, how the hell they know what she was saying?
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying? She was not a educated person.
right.
She did not write those kinds of. How would someone know
Right.
what she said?
Yeah.
So that's why I go to the point about history belongs to he or she
Who
who
writes
writes it. And generally, our history was not written. So I think part of W. Du Bois's fear that he would not be remembered, it was unprecedented for most bodies, not just him, for anybody to do that much writing about the things he wrote about.
Sure.
But that's why it's so important. Bishop, if I might, Representative Reynolds and I are working on that event. I want to bring him up and I tip out because he's going to go with me. You know, we're going to unveil that George Floyd statue
A couple of weeks.
in a couple of weeks, and we need to put the program together.
Yeah. Y'all, what you're really telling me is, Bishop, we wait on you to put the program together.
So I want to let the representative come up.
Yeah, come
and,
on,
and then
Rep.
after he speaks for a
Yeah,
little while, and then
yeah.
he and I gonna tip out.
Yeah.
Hey, you remember what I told you and your sister? It's not just your great grandfather. He's our great leader.
Great, just great.
Great grandfather.
Yeah.
You got me. So you get out here.
Yeah.
You too, scholar, Dr. Phil.
We're
All
gonna
right.
put this on the road, and we're gonna get on the bus, one of your buses, right, and take a tour
Yes.
to several schools. Come on, Rep. Reynolds. Now, let me say to those of you who are streaming, thank you for streaming, and I want you to post your questions, please. Put your questions in your post, and they're gonna send me some questions to ask in just a moment. And those of you who are in the live audience, please have your questions ready. We're going to come to you in just a moment. We don't want you to just be spectators, but participants in this conversation and in this dialogue. Jeff, let me just ask you, sitting here thinking about that, when you contacted me, and I don't know if I told you this or not, but I'm reading Du Bois scholar all these years. I'm studying and Rep Ron, and really trying to get into his head, right? And so I get this call in January. I can't think of the date. Crystal, my admin, sends me a text and calls me and says, "Hey, Bishop, the Du Bois family is trying to reach you to see if you be willing to do the service, preach the eulogy for the granddaughter of W.E.B. Du Bois." Now, I mean, this is just a normal day. I think it was a Wednesday or something like that. And I'm thinking, okay, who's pranking me? You know what I mean? I had not even heard that your mother had passed. I don't know. And I'm thinking, either somebody's pranking me or they've gotten the wrong number. And so I said to Crystal, Crystal, someone has that wrong. I said, send a message back to them to set up a conference call this evening, and that will let you know that they're not serious. And she calls me back and says, it's at 6:30 with the Zoom information. And honestly, I didn't know that you lived here and did not know your beautiful mother. One thing leads to another, and we end up in Great Barrington doing the service. I was blown away, Representative Reynolds. There in the hometown in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. You should travel there sometimes. It was cold. This was the heart of winter in February. Now, if you want to go in July. But to see all of the energy, investment, and activity around Du Bois, and before we even got to anything formal, we're in the town, Dr. Phil, going in a restaurant to eat. James Keys was with me, my guy. And when people ask, so what are you in town for? Well, we're here for the service of Du Bois's granddaughter. And to hear people, white or black, talk about your grandfather, say, we're proud of our native son. And to see flags on the telephone poles and light poles throughout the entire community devoted to the perpetuation and proclamation of the Du Bois legacy. And we're here now in Houston, Texas, fourth or third largest city in America. When has there ever been anywhere in the state of Texas, Houston, Texas, anything done to commemorate the legacy of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois? And I know you've seen all the fanfare, all the things that people do in other places. What does it say to you, Jeff, that here in your hometown, is there a school named after Du Bois? I'm just being facetious. I know it's not. I'm asking, what does it say to you that his legacy has not been memorialized here in Houston, Texas, and in the South?
Well, it's very unfortunate because we're in a city that has a large population of black people that don't know much about those that came before them to afford them so many rights. And my dad told me when I was about 5 that, there was going to be great things expected of me and that I was a relative of a very famous black man. And so I started writing papers about him when I would have a Black History Month event that I had to write some type of research paper. And so I would write about Du Bois, and I'd learn something every time I'd write about him. But one of the things that I did notice is that he always felt like people were telling black people in general that they couldn't do they couldn't do certain things. They couldn't be educated. They couldn't learn. They couldn't advance. They couldn't be in high places and hold high positions. And so he was trying to set this stage to show people that, yes, we could. And so that's a lot of the conversation I had with my mother was about showing black America that we can and giving kids inspiration to reach for the stars and not be told that, oh, you could do something small. You might could drive a truck, and not to belittle driving a truck, but to say anything you want. If you want to be a scientist, if you want to go to the moon, if you want to be a president of the United States or a president of another country, you could. He just wanted to inspire us.
Wow.
So as I hear many people talk about him and all that he's engaged in, it's just sometimes like, wow, that's what I say. I ask myself, what is it that we can't do if we all pull together? What is it that we can't decide that we can't do? And right now we gotta, like Bishop Dixon and I spoke, I guess where we're channeling all this is to our children in the Houston area. We want to influence them to shoot for the stars.
Yeah. So Rep. Reynolds, you've been in the Texas legislature now how many years?
12.
12 years, and just won re-election recently. Congratulations
Thank
again
you.
on that. And you're also the chair of the new
House Progressive Caucus.
House Progressive Caucus. I want to make sure I said it right, the new caucus. As a leader in the state of Texas, and you've been in every city in our state, there are no Du Boisian markers that I've seen in the state of Texas. And let me just poll the audience. I mean, how many of you think that there should be something in Texas that says we've been influenced by Du Bois, that we know who he is? I'm just asking a question. I mean, just to think about that. Why is that important?
Well, let me just say, Bishop Dixon, thank you for doing this. Thank you for bringing us together by that invitation to do the funeral. It's no coincidence. One of the things we fail to realize, there's more African Americans in Texas than any other state in the United States of America. And
say that again, because
there's more African Americans per the 2020 census in Texas than any other state in the entire United States of America. And it is shameful that we haven't done something, and I think that we have a new charge. And I'll just say this quickly, just to tell you my appreciation for your great-grandfather. Just like that Dr. Braley, when I was a president of the Missouri City NAACP branch, and I went to a national convention, and I learned some of the history of Dr. Du Bois. And it really made me more curious to do more of my own research. And I learned that this man was really an intellectual giant. He was way ahead of his time, just like Dr. Braley talked about, the precursor for the NAACP. He started way before that with the Niagara movement in 1905 to basically bring about equality for African Americans. Now, he was a pioneer. That wasn't being done. People were afraid. They were afraid of being lynched. And then he went and spoke truth to power and wrote about the atrocities that African Americans were facing all across this country. And thank God for him and him being bold and audacious and unafraid, unbought and unbossed, because his writings really helped change and evolve people to expose the Jim Crow segregation and all the suppression and all the things that African Americans were facing in America. And Bishop Dixon was more importantly, when he went to the NAACP and was the editor of the Crisis, he challenged those in the NAACP.
Yeah.
He challenged them
Yeah.
that he's not going to water down things to make other people not be so...
To be politically correct.
Exactly. He did that. And
yeah.
he was ahead of his time. And I've often marveled that if I could meet people in my life, it would be Thurgood Marshall, it would be Charles Hamilton Houston, and it would be W.E.B. Du Bois, because they did more, in my opinion, for African American freedom and liberation than pretty much anybody else. And so I just want you to know that we should do something, because he was a man, as the Dr. Phil talked about, it was amazing. And I challenge the audience to read The Souls of Black Folks. Read that. Read many of the periodicals that he had in the Crisis magazine. I still subscribe to the Crisis to this day because of W.E.B. Du Bois. And so I just want you to know that he was truly a godsend that really made it his life's mission to gain equality and equal treatment for blacks when it came to economics, when it came to healthcare, voting, as Carlos said. And he was really just so deep in his writing to identify the problem and then find solutions. So he was truly a man of his time.
So Dr. Phil, let me ask you, again, as a professor, as an instructor, listening to and thinking through Du Bois, and, you know, Representative Reynolds talking about the fact that he was a pioneer. Could it be argued that were it not for a W.E.B. Du Bois, we likely would not have had the likes of a Martin King? You know, sometimes we talk about Dr. King like he just came up from nowhere. But he was a student, a scholar himself. He studied history. There were people who inspired him, like Vernon Johns and others who were precursors to King. Exactly. How significant, because Dr. King did talk like that when he gave the speech about him in Harlem. Talk about the connection between how a Dr. King emerges because of the foundation of a precursor like Du Bois.
I love that word, foundation. We talked about the Crisis magazine. We talked about the NAACP. We talked about the Philadelphia Negro. And one of the things that Du Bois did is he built lasting institutions. The NAACP is still around. The Crisis is still in print. A journal that he started in Atlanta, the Phylon, is still in print.
Still in print.
We still read his books. And so The Souls of Black Folk is his best known work.
Yes.
It's been published in many editions. It's available online. And so his work was exposed to so many people. And if we take the Dr. King speech from February of 1968, honoring Dr. Du Bois.
Yes.
Honoring Dr. Du Bois is the title of the speech.
Yes.
And King chronicles Du Bois's publications. His book on the transatlantic slave trade,
Yes.
The Philadelphia Negro.
In that speech.
The Souls of Black Folk, John Brown, Darkwater, Black Reconstruction, The World in Africa. So the Black Flame trilogy. So many books. And the exposure to those ideas, the exposure to that capacious intellect is transformative, was transformative, continues to be transformative. And so if we look at that speech, we see not just Dr. King paying tribute and honoring this towering figure, but delving into the works and the words and the writing as well.
Yes.
And one
Bishop,
of the things that I remember was America was more comfortable with Booker T. Washington. They were more comfortable in the ideas that he had that black folks could, be carpenters and trades and things like that. And then W.E.B. Du Bois came around and said, hey, we can be intellectuals. And he talked about the talented 10th. And I think that was kind of, basically bold and audacious. I mean, hey, here is Booker T. Washington that they're embracing in the Atlanta Compromise. And Booker T. Washington said, W.B. Du Bois said, hey, wait a minute. We can be intellectuals. We can be lawyers and doctors and this and that. So I think that you're right. I mean, that's one of the things that he did to inspire people like Dr. King to elevate our thinking, and that we didn't have to just do blue-collar things, but we could do other things as well.
And I think to add on, I think you cannot deny the significance of historical black colleges.
Oh, gosh.
Because Du Bois was at the center, along with Benjamin Mays, this was at the center of Martin Luther King's educational experience.
Yes.
And so he went to University of Penn, you all may know that, but he worked there as in layman's terms today, would be a visiting professor, thinking that he was going to become on a tenure track.
Right.
And they never even gave him the opportunity to serve as a tenure track. It was Clark Atlanta, right? The Atlantic Center that really embraced Du Bois to grow. And much of his work was there because we didn't have resources. We although some of that was preserved, but I wanted to make sure that we bring in the discussion HBCU experience, because that was at the center of many. King,
Critical
you can't
point.
deny
Critical point.
that.
Not?
I'm glad you mentioned HBCUs, and I want to highlight a Texas connection real quick. Du Bois traveled to and through Houston in the 1930s and 40s, and the primary connection there was Prairie View State College. W.R. Banks and Glovina Banks, his wife, were Du Bois' students at Atlanta University in the early 1900s. And so they invited their professor for a dozen years or more. He came through Houston. He spoke at the Oddfellows Hall, and he spoke at Prairie View, regularly. And so that, and not just PV, but in 1950, he was offered a summer teaching job at the Texas State University for Negroes, what would become TSU. And so that didn't work out, but he proposed a social study of black life in the South. And he's an 80-something-year-old scholar at that point, so he was relentless in his pursuit of that scholarship.
Well, he never stopped working, right, up until, he was still writing. I'm still blown away. I think his last book was written when he was like a year before he died. He was just, he makes me feel like, why are you wasting your life? You know what I mean? Just incredible, the energy and his intellect. Let me just, are there any questions from the audience? Any questions from the audience? Anyone from the audience have a question? All right. We'll bring you a mic. We'll bring you a mic. Thank you.
I am a retired educator, and when I was given the charge to teach, and I'm saying charge, Black history the way it had not been taught before, that's what I concentrated on, the philosophies of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. I thank you tonight for this panel because you opened up some clarification that I had trying to explain those two different philosophies to my students. What I did was I stated that there were two different kinds of minds. Everybody is not intellectually gifted. You have some who are gifted educationally or intellectually so, and some that we use the term agriculture and vocational. But both of them have been very important to the development of our country. So I thank you for bringing this together. I did have some hang-ups, but thank you. And what I didn't know was that W.E. Du Bois was a hymn writer. This was my education for tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, he wrote music. And y'all, that's my auntie. Clap louder than that. That's my mother's sister, who is a Booker T. Washington high school graduate, and a tenured teacher, and a Prairie View graduate. And I think I saw my father walk in, who's Prairie View A&M, and she also taught at the Jack Yates High School, and others. So thank you for raising that question. Are there any other questions in the audience? On the front.
Good evening, Bishop, and to all of the distinguished guests. I was just sitting here thinking, in today's term, would we be able to connect the dots, considering the studies and the information that Dr. Du Bois shared and wrote, and the fact that his life was threatened possibly, and he was not a favorable son? Would you connect those dots now to him somewhat being maybe the founder of critical theory, race theory?
Okay.
I mean, would there be some connections there? Because he stood at a time where it wasn't popular to write about history.
Yeah.
Would that be?
Let Dr. Brady respond to that, and if you like Dr. Fields, if you like to work.
In short, absolutely. So even when you go and you read Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, they give credence to Du Bois and James Cone. I mean, all of that. Ida B. Wells. I mean, Black theology. It's still connected. If you read some of James Cone's work, he is going to talk about W.E. Du Bois.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because critical race theory is an interdisciplinary methodology, the connection to Du Bois is bringing a historical perspective, a sociological perspective, a literary perspective to the question of race and inequality and to the pursuit of democracy and liberation.
Okay.
Great question.
So why would we still have these same threats? I mean, of knowledge. Why would we still have these same fears?
Well, the thing I think that we need to be mindful of, again, nothing is new under the sun, right? And there is yet a fear of people having access to pure knowledge. What Commissioner Ellis mentioned a couple of different times, history is written from the perspective of those in power.
Right.
Okay. So you got to be careful when you study history, because sometimes you're reading people's version of history that favors them. It's interesting to me. For example, I'm a Western fan. I watch Westerns a lot. I go to sleep on Westerns. I've seen most of them at least 10 times. But you know who's going to win from the start.
Mm-hmm. It's already written. The script is written.
And you know who the good guys are all the time. It's who wrote the movie. Yeah.
And the system hasn't changed. And Du Bois had a critique of the system. And this system has not changed.
Yeah.
And in order for that to change, we have to deal with the external issues, but there's internal issues too, because Du Bois had a critique of the church. Du Bois had a critique of entertainment.
Yes.
Du Bois had, even the Talented Tenth was not just about, those who were at the the top, but he understood that we couldn't afford just to go and buy the big cars and the big houses, because it was the knowledge that we had which allowed us to have some type of salary at the time or stipend. So we had to give back. So it was around this notion of service that it was a burden upon us. So it was a system.
Not personal prosperity for the sake of personal prosperity's sake.
Right.
He was talking about talented tenth being who you could be in order to help pull the 90% up.
Gotcha.
And that's something that I think we lose sometimes, don't you think? Because we live now in an age of individualized prosperity.
Yeah.
And I prosper in isolation. I move away from the problem. Yeah. Du Bois saw the fact that the talented tenth would have the responsibility and then the capacity for reaching back to empower those who had not been as empowered. So it's very important. So I want to ask you, Dr. Phil, it became very difficult for Du Bois to make a living while he was doing all of this work. And I think sometimes we don't think about the sacrifice that Du Bois or persons of that same fiber would have to make in order to make the impact that he was able to make.
That's right. He was forcibly retired from Atlanta University in 1944, then spent 4 years working on international civil rights at the NAACP before being pushed out in 1948. So after 1948 to 1963, he didn't have an institutional affiliation. He wrote books. He made money from royalties. He hit the lecture circuit every single year. And those economic prospects and possibilities were further curtailed in the 1950s. Yet he continued to write. He wrote a book in 1952 called In Battle for Peace. Yeah. He committed his life to the peace movement.
Peace movement, yeah.
But yeah, he had to speak, had to write, and that was difficult work. But the political conditions of the 40s and 50s curtailed his economic opportunities. But he forged ahead.
So Jeff, as we try to turn this ship into the harbor, this is your great-grandfather we're speaking of, who made these enormous sacrifices and yet enormous contributions. And as we reflect on it this evening, you know, he's writing to make a living, yet he kept in communication with the family via the pen because he traveled so very much. I think sometimes we really don't process the human sacrifice. You know, greatness comes with a price, right? And some people envy greatness, but they don't envy the price that greatness has to pay. When you think about Du Bois traveling, he traveled a lot by boat, by ship. If he was going overseas, this was not when you could catch a flight to fly over. He traveled for weeks at a time away from his family, speaking and lecturing and making a living and trying to send money back. You got some letters that he wrote to your mother, handwritten letters that he wrote to your mother while traveling. Can you talk just a minute about that from that personal perspective of what your grandfather sacrificed in order to make the impact on the betterment of our country?
I think my grandmother got upset with him on occasion because she would write him and it would be months before he would respond. And so she'd be like, is something wrong? Did something happen? So she would write Shirley, and then Shirley'd say, no, everything's fine. He's just busy. And then so when he'd finally write back, he'd say, you know, I'm in my 80s, time's flying by. I didn't realize it was 3 months. Forgive me. I'm trying to make things happen. I'm trying to help our people. And when you're someone's daughter, you don't really look at it from that point of view. You want to hear from your father. You want to know that he's fine, and you're accustomed to hearing from him fairly often. So as he aged, it got to where he lost track of time. And it might have hurt my grandmother's feelings at times, but he made it up in the letters that he wrote. They were kind and they were permissive, and he asked for her forgiveness. Dr. Phil and I ran across a letter that my grandmother wrote, you know, and I guess Shirley responded, and then Du Bois wrote back, and he said he just lost track of time. And, you know, my mother talked a lot about how great of a planner he was, and I guess as time passed, it was harder to plan to do all the things he wanted. In his mind, he foresaw wanting to do so much in such little time.
And of course, his travels took him overseas. I mean, now listen, there was no internet. It wasn't like you could pick up the phone call and place a loan to the call to say, hey, I'm in Ghana, or, you know, I'm in Asia. He's a global traveler. Get this, most of us are not global travelers with everything we've got. He's a global traveler, Rep. Ron, when you could, I mean, to think about that, and I think that that's one of the important reasons we need to study Du Bois, our kids need to, because when you read Du Bois, you're going to read about this black guy traveling to foreign places, being received, making speeches, making contributions, dealing with world issues. From his perspective, it challenges you to broaden your horizons. But it also challenges us to understand sacrifice, because most of us are raised to be geared towards convenience. I mean, you know, are you coming home tonight? What do you mean you won't be home for dinner tonight? Can you imagine had he chosen the normal life? Can you imagine Dr. King? There would be no Dr. King had he not been willing to leave his family long enough to make the impact, Dr. Phil. I'm saying, I think sometimes we underappreciate what it takes. I mean, Rep. Reynolds, when you're in the legislature and y'all meeting for months in special session number 3, people don't understand the enormous sacrifice that it takes. They want the results, but the cost of it is severe. And so your grandmother, or your mother rather, traveled some places with your great-grandfather. She got to see the world through his eyes. And then you got to see the world through her eyes. That's pretty special, isn't it? I mean, don't be modest right now. Just.
It is. My mother spoke quite a bit about the treatment that he got in other countries. And what was embarrassing is that he was born in the United States and wasn't treated very well here, but he could go to Germany and was treated like a king. My mom spoke of staying in palaces. They wouldn't let him stay in hotels in some of the countries he traveled. And he would stay with kings and queens, and she'd get to meet their sons and daughters. She would see him throwing rose petals behind him and just the royal treatment. And she just was like, this is amazing how they treat him in other places just because of what he knows and what he's trying to achieve and the sacrifices that he's making for people of color. Because it just wasn't a problem here. It was a problem almost everywhere.
Prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown. Familiarity still breeds contempt, right? This has been a robust conversation. I could, obviously I could get very comfortable with this, but I want to thank each of you. Dr. Phil, you have a parting word you want to give before we conclude tonight?
If I could read a quote from
Of course.
the doctor. So this is a quote about freedom that Du Bois ended his 1947 book, The World in Africa, with. And I invite you to remember the point that I made early on, that this idea of freedom that Du Bois wrote about was not simply personal liberation, personal liberty. There was a communal aspect,
yes,
and a responsibility to use one's gifts for the greater good of all. And so this is the preview to that quote.
Sure.
Reader of dead words who would live deeds, This is the flowering of my logic. I dream of a world of infinite and valuable variety, not in laws of gravity or atomic weights, but in human variety, but more especially and far above and beyond this, in a realm of true freedom, in thought and dream, fantasy and imagination, in gift, aptitude, and genius. All possible manner of difference, topped with freedom of soul to do and be, and freedom of thought to give to a world and build into it, all wealth of inborn individuality. Each effort to stop this freedom of being is a blow to democracy. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Wow. 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 Jeff, a closing parting word from you tonight.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out, and all that are watching and listening.
Send a shout out to the Great Barrington crew too. I know that they're watching.
Hello to the Bridge and W.E.B. Du Bois Committee in Great Barrington, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring them up. About 2013 or 2014, when I traveled there, they were trying to put W.E.B. Du Bois's name on a school. They felt like institution education is where his name belonged. And there was a lot of issue between townspeople about putting his name on a school, and I was told that they'd been trying to do it for years. It may take 10, it may take 20 years. And they asked me to write letters and to do a few videos, and we started working at it. And lo and behold, about 2 years ago, they approved to put his name on a school. So I feel that there's hope that change can come about with effort, and maybe I need to exert more effort. The one thing that I'd like to see happen, I was extremely moved by the Martin Luther King movies that I've had a chance to see over my lifetime. I've been moved by the Malcolm X movies, the Muhammad Ali movies. I would like to see a motion picture done with his life from start to finish. And if I could see that before I close my eyes, then I would feel like something had been accomplished.
Yes. Then the children won't forget him. Yeah. Europa, are you there? All right, why don't you step up here very quick to the center, and just with the certificates, because it's not going to come through the system correctly. All right. Go ahead, Janice. Your question while Europa's coming.
I'm not pretending anything like that. My question is this: when is the plan to try and have a W.E. Du Bois Day, since he is or has the connection to Houston, Texas?
Well, I think, Janice, to that point, if anybody here knows Mayor Sylvester Turner, can y'all call him and ask him, can he do a W.E.B. Du Bois Day in Houston? And I mean, somebody here knows him. I don't know anybody here know the mayor. Right.
I'm talking about something with stuff, we're always doing things undercover.
No, I mean a big event.
Right.
Yes. We're on the same page.
Okay.
But I'm saying if the mayor would join us in championing this and make it an official deal, then we can put the committee together and have a real W.E.B. Du Bois event that honors his legacy, and have Dr. Phil and others to talk at that event, right? I think that'd be great. It'd be awesome. And I know that there's paraphernalia here, Dr. Phil, information here that you might want to talk about after we've finished. If people want to come up and give a little insight, Jeff, about what's on the table here. Let me tell you, this is sacred stuff. It's just amazing that it's sitting right here in front of us in Houston. You're not in Washington, D.C. at the National Negro African American Museum. You're at the Community Faith Church with this kind of information right in front of you. So excited. Come on, Europa.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bishop Dixon. this has been an extremely enlightful.
Walking on, have a girl. Yes, sir.
Okay, let me come up here to the stage.
You must have the Congresswoman on the line.
I do.
I
have
know you did.
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee on
Yes,
the line,
indeed.
everyone. And so without further delay, because this has been an awesome, inspirational discussion on tonight. And so at this time, I ask that you receive our Congresswoman from the 18th Congressional District, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Thank you so very much, Bishop Dixon. Thank you for
Good evening,
this outstanding
Congresswoman.
effort.
Good evening. How are you?
I am wonderful, thank you. I'm en route to Washington, but I did not want to miss at least a very brief word on a very unique conversation that only Bishop Dixon, the community of faith, and all of the audience could have had the great fortune of participating in on this day, May 9th. To Mr. Jeff Peck, the great-grandson of the late Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and to, as a Du Bois scholar and professor, and then Dr. Phil Sanitaire, and of course, our outstanding members of the public officials, Commissioner Ellis, Representative Ron Reynolds, and of course the mayor and his representative. Let me just simply say these words. W. Du Bois was a giant scholar, but he was a passionate fighter for justice and an advocate for people who had just emerged out of slavery. As one who is carrying H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals, I know of the great leadership that W. Du Bois gave to equality. And I will just offer his words, often said, strive for that greatness of spirit that measures life not by its disappointments, but by its possibilities. And he was always intellectually and socially looking for the possibilities of a recently freed people. And this effort that you have put forward really calls out for a continuing acknowledgement and honoring of W. Du Bois and reigniting his message and his cry for justice, because we are certainly in the midst of the need for a greater fight for justice in America, as evidenced by the Supreme Court and other deficiencies, the lack of voting protections, and again, the need to pass H.R. 40, the Commission to Study Reparation Proposals. So my words tonight are congratulatory and to extend my hand, Bishop Dixon, for any collaborative effort to highlight this giant intellectual and to be reminded that strive for that greatness of spirit that measures life not by its disappointments that many may have, but by its possibilities. And be reminded that a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. All of that should give us guidance and leadership to honor Dr. W.E. Du Bois. Congratulations, and again, I look forward to working with you. Congratulations to all of you present. God bless you all.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And also on behalf of the Congresswoman, we have this special congressional commendation for you, Bishop, and then to all of our panel speakers as well from our Congresswoman. It basically just says thank you for your service in presenting Empower Talk conversation. And on behalf of the Congresswoman, I present this to you to say thank you for your contributions towards the Houston community, and that we are very appreciative and you're most deserving of the respect, the honor, and the admiration of the congressional, of the Congress from Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And I'll actually give the other ones to you, to all of the panelists, so I'll put those in your hands.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. Kirk, grab this for me, please. Thank you so much. Let me just recognize tonight one of our leading attorneys, and he's also a professor himself. I want to recognize Mr. Edgar Colon, who is on the board of the Harris County Sports and Convention Corporation. He chairs our board. Give him a hand being here tonight. We appreciate him being here tonight, along with Ms. Kate David, who is our attorney at our Harris County Sports and Convention Corporation. And I think her son is with us. Kate, will you just stand? Thank you so much. And their firm also supports our Compassion and Action food distribution programs. We appreciate them for all that they do. Let me say to each one of you, I am so honored that you were here tonight. We appreciate that. This has been amazing. What I would like to do, I get inspiration every now and then. I get a vision. And I just thought about Dr. Field. One of the things that we can start doing, Ron, this summer, we can have through Good Gang USA, our youth organization, a W.E.B. Du Bois scholarship. Yeah. And we'll let the Congresswoman help lead the committee since she's committed to helping us. But we'll be a part of that, and we can raise some money to be a part burden of the under Good Gang USA, a Du Bois scholarship, and get our youth to write essays to win that scholarship so that they can learn more about W.E.B. Du Bois. And because, as we say in Good Gang USA, exposure what? Expands expectations. So we're excited about that. Let me thank each of you for being here tonight. Thank those of you who viewed being here tonight. Pastor, Dr. John Ogletree over here. Dr. John Ogletree, thank you so very much for being here. Bishop Livingston, Pastor Beckett was here. Any other pastors? I'm sorry, Pastor Carl Colston. Thank you for being here, man. We appreciate you. Our spiritual sons. All of you for being here tonight. It's an honor. It's been a pleasure. It's been a blessing. And I hope that you've been informed, inspired, as well as instructed, and ultimately ignited to go and make a difference in your sphere of influence. All right? God bless you. Let's stand together. Let's stand together. This has been Empower Talk Live, and any of you who want to support Empower Talk in this event tonight, you can text the word GIVE, G-I-V-E, to 713-338-9011. Text the word GIVE to 713-338-9011 and click on the Empower Talk piece and give a donation to support this effort so that we can continue doing it. You just can't keep a car moving without fuel. I don't care how beautiful the car is, how wonderful the driver is, without gas in the tank, the car just ain't moving. So thank you for putting a little fuel in the tank. Janice, don't give any more than $100. That's it. That's your limit, $100. Hey, man, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? No more than that. Brother Goodlow, don't give any more than 100. All right? But whatever you give is good. Or if you want to leave something with us tonight, you can do that. Our men will be standing down front. If you want to give a check tonight or whatever you want to do, say, I supported the effort, because wherever there is an impression, there ought to be an expression. Okay? Wherever there's an impression, there should be an expression. Thank you so very much. Father, bless us tonight. Thank you for the rich legacy of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Thank you for his family and for the generational heritage. Thank you for the mantle that Jeff is carrying to keep his grandfather's legacy alive. We thank you, God, for Dr. Field, and thank you for Dr. Carla Braley and for Rep. Ron Reynolds and Commissioner Ellis for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for the Congresswoman who chimed in, even through technology, to add weight and substance to this conversation tonight. But ultimately, God, we thank you for your goodness and your grace towards us, that you have so sufficiently blessed us with gifts, skills, and abilities and opportunities to make a difference. Father, we pray that you would enhance what we've been doing, enlarge our impact, increase our contribution, that when we have left this planet, someone will favorably remember that we came this way. We pray in the name of our Christ with great thanksgiving. Amen. Amen. God bless each of you. Thank you for tuning in. God bless you. Thank you for supporting Empower Talk tonight. Give yourselves a hand. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.